It was a regular afternoon. I was home working on some project when I heard a knock at my door. Not a normal knock, but the kind that sounds like someone who thinks they still belong there. I opened it and there she was, Chloe, standing in my doorway like no time had passed. Except her whole posture was different, harder somehow. And it took me exactly 3 seconds to notice she was pregnant. She didn't look embarrassed or apologetic. She looked determined. And before I could even process what I was seeing, she said, "I need stability, and you always knew how to be stable." It was like she was proposing a business arrangement instead of crawling back to the guy she'd left for someone more exciting. I just stood there, hands still on the doorknob, thinking about how some people really do see other humans as just resources to manage, and wondering what possible universe she lived in where this approach would work. See, Chloe and I had met back in college, one of those setups where a mutual friend insists you'd be perfect together. And for a long time, we were. Or at least I thought so. I was the guy who showed up, paid attention, remembered the small stuff. I built a life that wasn't flashy, but felt secure, like we were actually going somewhere. She used to say she loved that about me, how I wasn't all talk, how I made her feel safe. And I believed her, because why wouldn't I? But somewhere around year 3, something shifted. It was like she started measuring our relationship against some invisible standard I didn't know existed. Little comments started creeping in about how we never did anything exciting anymore, how all my friends were boring, how I didn't have enough ambition. Every time I'd try to plan something special, she'd find a reason it wasn't quite right. I'd suggest a weekend trip and she'd say we couldn't afford it. Then 2 days later, she'd drop money on clothes she'd wear once. And when I'd point that out, suddenly I was controlling. The weirdest part was how she started picking fights over nothing, like she needed me to react, to prove I cared enough to lose my cool. And when I stayed calm, that made her even angrier. I didn't realize it then, but she was building a case, stacking up evidence that I wasn't enough, that our life together was somehow my fault. Then this guy, Leo, started appearing in conversations. Someone from her gym or her friend group. I never got the full story, but everyone in our neighborhood knew him. That type who's always got people around him, always got some story about what he's doing, who he knows, where he's going. She'd mention him casually at first, just a name in passing, but then it became a pattern. Like she'd bring him up specifically to watch my reaction. She started coming home later, dressing differently, checking her phone constantly, and angling it away when I walked by. And when I finally asked if something was going on, she flipped it on me, said I was insecure and paranoid. I wasn't stupid. I could see what was happening. But part of me kept hoping I was wrong, that she'd snap out of whatever this was and we'd get back to normal. Instead, she started comparing everything I did to what he apparently would do, how he wouldn't overthink things, how he just lived in the moment. I realized she wasn't just pulling away. She was auditioning her next situation while still living in mine. The breaking point came on a regular evening. Nothing dramatic, no special occasion. She just walked in and told me we needed to talk. I knew from her tone this wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict. She sat down across from me and delivered this whole speech about needing more, deserving better, finding someone on her level, like she'd rehearsed it. She actually said, "I need to be with someone I deserve." And I remember thinking how that one sentence told me everything about how she saw me, like I was some participation trophy she'd outgrown. I didn't beg, didn't argue, didn't try to change her mind. I just asked one question. "Have you already decided, or do you actually want to talk about this?" She hesitated for maybe 2 seconds, then launched into this lecture about personal growth and finding herself. I knew she'd already moved on in her head. I stood up, walked to the kitchen drawer where we kept spare keys, and told her to put hers on the counter. She looked shocked, like she expected me to fight for her, to give her the dramatic scene she could tell people about later. But I was done performing. I said, "If you're leaving, let's do this clean." The way her face changed, like she suddenly realized I wasn't going to play the heartbroken ex who'd sit around waiting, that almost made her angrier than the breakup itself. She tried to start another speech about how this was hard for her, too. And I just cut her off. Told her she could grab her stuff now or come back tomorrow when I wasn't home. Her choice. But either way, this conversation was over. The silence that followed felt massive, like the entire apartment was holding its breath. She finally stood up, grabbed her keys, and walked out without another word. I sat there for probably an hour after she left. Not sad exactly, more like angry at how unfair the whole thing was. Because I hadn't cheated, hadn't lied, hadn't done anything except be the stable guy. And apparently, that was my crime. The next few days were mechanical. I boxed up her remaining stuff, left it in the building's lobby for her to collect, changed my locks because something told me she'd kept a copy, and blocked her on everything except email in case there were practical things to handle. People kept trying to tell me I'd dodged a bullet, that I was better off. And I'd nod and agree, because what else do you say? But mostly, I just felt numb, like someone had rearranged my entire life and expected me to act grateful. Months turned into years. I moved to a better place across town, focused on work, started actually building something instead of just coasting. Slowly, the whole relationship faded into that category of things that happened to a different version of me. I dated occasionally, nothing serious, and honestly, I was fine with that. I'd learned my lesson about trying to be someone's foundation when they were still shopping around for upgrades. I stopped thinking about her completely. Stopped wondering if she was happy with her popular guy. Stopped caring about the whole situation. And that's exactly when life decided to get interesting. So, Chloe didn't wait for an invitation, she just stepped past me into my apartment like she'd done the math on how long it would take me to process the situation, and decided to use that window. I closed the door, more out of habit than hospitality. She was already scanning the place, taking inventory of what had changed, what had upgraded. I could see her brain working overtime, trying to figure out how this fit into whatever plan she'd constructed. She settled onto my couch without asking, arranged herself carefully to minimize the obvious bump under her sweater, and launched into what I can only describe as a pitch meeting. No apologies, no acknowledgement of how we'd ended, just straight into logistics. Talking about how she'd thought things through and realized what really mattered in life, and how I'd always been the responsible one, the one who thought long-term. I stayed standing, leaning against the kitchen counter. Arms crossed, watching her perform this weird corporate version of reconciliation, where she was basically proposing I sign on as a life partner the way you'd hire a contractor. She said she wasn't asking me to pretend the past didn't happen, that we were both adults now and could make adult decisions. What she needed was someone solid, someone who could provide structure. The word she kept using was partnership. Like we were forming an LLC instead of discussing a relationship. The whole time she's talking, I'm realizing she hasn't once asked how I've been, what I've been doing, or acknowledged that she's asking something absolutely insane from someone she discarded. I let her finish her whole presentation, didn't interrupt. Just let her lay out this entire fantasy where I'd welcome her back and take on raising another man's kid, because apparently, I'm the safety net variety of human. When she finally stopped talking and looked at me expectantly, I asked my first question, kept my voice level, almost curious. Do you need a husband, or a service? She blinked like I'd switched languages, started to answer, and I held up one hand and asked another, did you come here for me, or for my ability to carry weight? Her face did this complicated thing where she clearly wanted to be offended, but also realized that getting emotional would undermine her whole adult partnership angle. So, she tried to laugh it off, said I was being dramatic. I wasn't being dramatic. I was being clear, maybe for the first time in our entire relationship, and it was obviously throwing her off because the old me would have already been trying to make her comfortable, offering water, asking about her health, doing all the caretaking things that made me such a reliable option. This version of me just stood there, waiting for actual answers. And watching her scramble to adjust her approach was almost fascinating, in a clinical way. She switched tactics, went softer, said she'd made mistakes, but she'd learned from them. That Leo had been exciting but ultimately empty. That she'd realized too late what she'd given up. It might have worked if she'd led with that. But coming after the business proposal, it just sounded like another strategy, like she had a whole folder of approaches and was working through them systematically. I told her she could stay 1 week. Not because I was considering anything, but because I wanted to handle this the right way, document everything, make sure there was no drama she could twist later. She looked relieved, probably thought she'd gotten her foot in the door and could work her magic from the inside. But I was already running a completely different program. I set her up in my guest room, told her we'd split household costs for the week, treated the whole thing like she was a short-term tenant I was tolerating. She kept trying to create moments. Would cook dinner and played it all romantic, would sit too close on the couch during movies, would reference old jokes and memories like she could rebuild our history through callbacks. And every time, I just nodded politely and maintained distance. The fourth night, she apparently decided subtlety wasn't working and sent me a message around midnight. One of those photos that's supposed to remind a guy what he's missing. The kind of thing that probably would have destroyed old me. I looked at it, felt absolutely nothing except maybe secondhand embarrassment, and typed back 2 words, "not working." I could hear her gasp from the other room. That sharp intake of breath when someone realizes their power move just bounced off completely. And the next morning, she was cold and hostile, in that specific way people get when their manipulation fails. She made some comment about how I'd changed, become hard. Like being emotionally unavailable was somehow worse than using someone as a backup plan. I just shrugged and told her people adapt. The week was almost up when she started asking more questions about my life. Not out of genuine interest, but because she'd noticed things that didn't add up with her mental image of stagnant, reliable me. The furniture was nicer. I had actual art on the walls. My laptop setup suggested I was doing more than just a basic job. When she asked what I'd been up to work-wise, I kept it vague, but mentioned I'd started a company with 2 partners about 18 months after we split. Her whole energy shifted immediately, like I'd revealed I was playing a different game than she'd assumed. Suddenly she wanted details, wanted to know how successful it was, what kind of revenue we were doing, whether I had employees. I gave her the bare minimum, watched her recalculate in real time, and that's when I mentioned almost as an afterthought that I was engaged. I didn't show her photos, didn't volunteer a name, just stated it as a fact, the same way you'd mention you'd gotten a new car. But her reaction told me everything about why she'd really come back. It wasn't about me specifically. It was about what she thought I represented, the safe, boring option that would still be sitting exactly where she left it. And discovering I'd not only moved on, but moved up, clearly bothered her more than anything else that week. She got quiet, excused herself early, and I heard her making phone calls from the guest room, her voice tight and angry, though I couldn't make out the words. The next afternoon, I was at the office working through some contracts when my phone started blowing up. Texts from neighbors, one from my building manager, all basically asking what the hell was happening at my place. I pulled up the security camera feed I'd installed when I moved to the new apartment, and there he was, Leo himself, standing in front of my building making a scene. He was yelling, gesturing at windows, playing to the small crowd of neighbors who'd come out to watch. And I could see Chloe standing off to the side, looking distressed in that performed way people do when they want to seem helpless. He was doing the whole aggressive, territorial thing, loud enough that I could practically hear the speech through the camera feed. All about respect and stepping up and being a man. The usual script guys like that run when they want to establish dominance. My first instinct, the old programming, was to rush home and handle it, to protect her even though she'd put me in this situation. But I stopped myself and actually thought it through. This was theater. This was her creating drama to force my hand, to make me play the hero so she could frame our story as me fighting for her. And the absolute best thing I could do was refuse the role entirely. I called the non-emergency police line, explained the situation calmly, gave them my address, mentioned there was a man harassing residents and threatening property, and then I went back to work. My building manager called 20 minutes later to tell me the police had shown up, that Leo had gotten aggressive with them. Apparently, he had an outstanding warrant for something unrelated, probably unpaid tickets or a missed court date, the kind of thing that guys like that always seem to have following them around. They arrested him right there in front of everyone. And according to my neighbor who watched the whole thing, Chloe completely melted down, tried to play the victim, told the police I'd set this up, that I was harassing her. The whole 9 yards of desperation. The police apparently asked if she lived at my address. She said no. They asked if she had permission to be there, and she had to admit the week was up anyway, so they basically told her to collect her things and leave. I got home around 7 that evening and she was gone. No note, no text, just some groceries she'd bought still in the fridge and a coffee mug in the sink. I packed up the groceries, left them in a box by the door in case she came back for them, washed the mug, and sat down to think about next steps. My fiancée, Sarah, came over that night. I'd told her the whole situation before it started, and she just hugged me and said she was proud of how I'd handled it, that a lot of guys would have gotten sucked into the drama. I realized, sitting there, that this was what actual partnership looked like. Someone who trusted me to handle my past without needing to control it, who didn't see my boundaries as rejection, but as self-respect. And the contrast to what I'd just been dealing with was almost funny. We talked about whether I needed to take any legal steps. And she suggested I at least document everything in case my ex tried to cause problems later. So, I wrote up a timeline of events and kept all the texts and camera footage. But I didn't pursue any formal restraining order or legal action, because honestly, I just wanted it over. 2 years went by, and I barely thought about either of them, Chloe or Leo. They'd faded into that category of bullet dodged and lesson learned. My company had grown. We'd moved to a bigger office space in a different part of town, hired a small team, and I was finally at a place where work felt like something I'd built instead of something I was just doing. Then one afternoon, my business partner, Mark, mentioned in passing that we'd hired someone new for facilities management, part-time cleaning and building maintenance. And didn't I used to date someone with that same unusual first name? My stomach dropped before my brain fully caught up. And sure enough, when I checked the new hire paperwork, there she was. She listed a different address, working part-time evening hours. And according to our HR person, had been pretty desperate for the job, willing to take whatever shift worked for us. I never saw her directly. Our schedules didn't overlap, and the facilities team worked mainly after 6. But occasionally, I'd notice small things. A vacuum left in a different spot, supplies restocked in a pattern I vaguely remembered from when we lived together. Mark asked once if it was weird, if I wanted him to handle any interaction with that department. And I told him honestly, it wasn't necessary. She was just someone I used to know. And as long as she did her job, her history with me was irrelevant. I heard through the office gossip network that she had a kid now, maybe 2 years old, that the father came around sometimes but not consistently. That she was working multiple jobs trying to make ends meet. And part of me, the old part, wanted to feel something about that, wanted to help or intervene or do something. But I'd learned that lesson already. Learned it expensive and permanent. The thing about working in the same building as someone you're actively avoiding is that eventually, the universe decides to test your resolve. And for me, that test came about 6 months after she'd started, when I had to stay late one evening to meet a client from a different time zone. I was walking to my car around 9 o'clock, mentally running through the next day's schedule, when I heard a kid crying in the parking garage. That specific exhausted wail that means they're way past tired and into complete meltdown mode. I looked over and there she was, Chloe, trying to wrestle a toddler into a car seat while juggling her phone and what looked like a broken bag spilling groceries onto the concrete. The kid was arching his back, refusing to cooperate. And she was doing that thing parents do when they're at the absolute end of their patience but trying not to lose it in public. Our eyes met for maybe half a second, and I saw her whole face cycle through shock, embarrassment, anger, and something that might have been hope. And I made a decision right there that probably says everything about who I'd become. I kept walking, got in my car, drove home, and didn't look back. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I'd learned the hard way that my help always came with strings I didn't intentionally attach. That she'd find a way to turn one moment of assistance into a foothold back into my life. My fiancé noticed I was quiet that night, asked if something was wrong, and I told her about the parking garage, about the choice I'd made, and waited for her to tell me I'd been cold or heartless. Instead, she took my hand and said, "Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is maintain the boundary." That you jumping in to help would have confused the kid, given her false hope, and ultimately made everything messier for no good reason. 3 months later, Leo showed up at our office building, not inside, but lingering around the entrance, clearly waiting for her shift to end. I was leaving for lunch and nearly walked right past him before he recognized me. The look on his face was pure calculation, like he was trying to figure out if I was a threat or an opportunity. He didn't say anything directly, just made this comment to the air about how funny it was that some people couldn't let go of the past, how pathetic it was when guys orbited around their exes. And I realized he thought I'd engineered her getting this job, that I was somehow keeping tabs or maintaining control. I stopped, turned to face him fully, and said the only thing I'd say to him in this entire story. I work here. She works here. That's where the connection ends. He puffed up like he wanted to make it physical, started going on about respect and territory and all the usual posturing. I just pulled out my phone and opened the camera app. Didn't record, didn't threaten, just held it visibly. His whole demeanor changed because guys like that live on being able to operate in gray areas where it's just their word against yours. He backed off, muttered something about not being worth his time, and left. But I reported the interaction to building security anyway. Had them flag his description in case he came back. The security guy asked if I wanted to press trespassing charges since he had no business being there. I thought about it, genuinely considered it, but ultimately said, no, just keep him out moving forward, because I was tired of giving either of them more energy than they'd already taken. The office rumor mill eventually filled in gaps I never asked about because people can't help themselves when there's drama, even if it's someone else's life falling apart. Apparently, she tried to get him to step up multiple times, had taken him to court for child support, and he'd claimed he couldn't pay, was working under the table somewhere, and dodging garnishment. She'd applied for state assistance, was living in a small apartment on the other side of town, had her mom helping with childcare when she worked nights. The whole struggling single-parent situation that might have pulled at my heartstrings once, but now just made me feel tired. One of the younger guys in my office, Daniel, fresh out of college and still idealistic, asked me once if I ever thought about helping her out since we had history. And I told him something I'd learned the expensive way. You can't save people from consequences they chose. And trying just teaches them that consequences are optional if they find the right person to manipulate. He looked uncomfortable, probably thought I was being harsh, but 6 months later, he got burned by someone doing almost the same pattern and came back to apologize for judging. I told him there was nothing to apologize for. That some lessons only land when you live them yourself. My wedding happened about a year after all this. Small ceremony, just close friends and family. Everything the opposite of the big production Chloe used to plan in her head when we were together. I'd occasionally wondered if she'd somehow hear about it and try to crash or send a message. But the day came and went perfectly. No drama, no interruptions, just two people choosing each other with clear eyes and honest intentions. Sarah knew the whole story, every ugly part, and married me anyway, not despite my past, but with full understanding of what it taught me about boundaries and self-respect. We were going through photos a few weeks later, and she asked if I ever regretted how things ended with my ex, if I wished I'd handled anything differently. And I had to really think about it. The answer was no. Not because everything I did was perfect, but because every choice I made after she left was about building something real instead of managing someone else's chaos. I'd learned that love without respect is just performance. That stability without appreciation becomes a prison. And that the right person doesn't make you prove your worth. They just see it. I still work in that building. Still occasionally see evidence that she's been through a particularly well-organized supply closet or the specific way certain things get arranged. And it doesn't bother me anymore. She's just someone who works in my building, someone I used to know in a different version of my life. And that distance isn't cruelty, it's clarity. I heard recently that Leo finally got arrested for something more serious. That he's facing actual jail time, and that Chloe's been posting on social media about being a strong single mom, finding herself, all the usual narratives people construct when the story didn't go how they planned. Part of me hopes she figures it out. Hopes the kid grows up okay. Hopes she eventually learns what I had to learn about choosing better and being honest. But those hopes are distant and impersonal, the kind you'd have for any stranger struggling. The lesson I took from all of this isn't about her, or him, or even that relationship specifically. It's about understanding that some people see love as a transaction and others as a choice. And once you figure out which one you're dealing with, everything else gets simpler. I'm not her villain and I'm not her hero. I'm just someone who learned to close doors that needed closing. And the peace that came from that decision is worth more than any drama I could have gotten sucked into. Someone once told me that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And I finally understand what they meant. Because when I think about her now, I don't feel anger or longing or regret. I just feel nothing. And that nothing feels like freedom. What boundaries in your own life might need reinforcing?